Okay, in the last panel, the panelists started talking about innovation. And I think this particular panel session will go deeper into the subject of China being part of the global innovation network. If you look at the evolution of China, it used to be, for the last 20, 30 years, the major production and supply site of many global value chains. And China has evolved from being the factory of the world, and China, of course, is still the factory of the world, into a major market, and then now as a potentially major source of innovation. When we talk about innovation, of course, I think the last panel has anchored more on the VCs and also the startup perspective of innovation. But innovation can also occur from the fundamental materials used in making products, in the manufacturing process. In manufacturing is also a potential place where innovation can occur, to the products, to the new channels, and also the last panelist also has mentioned, Jenny talked about the business model innovation. It also can happen besides startup companies. It could also be from existing large enterprises, even government sector, as well as the service sector. All can play a role in innovation. So today, I'm delighted to have two panelists. One is Sidney Lu, who is the chairman and CEO of Foxconn Interconnect Technologies, Foxconn being a part of the Hong Hai Precision Group. And so that's a major electronic manufacturing service company. And Sidney himself has grew out of that world of using innovation to drive values. And also sitting next to me is Michael Marks. Michael Marks is the founding partner of Riverwood Capital, but he also was the former chairman and CEO of Flextronics. And he grew the company from $150 million to $15 billion before he stepped down. So both of them have tremendous experience in looking at both from starting germane innovation seed to also building enterprises that also have innovation as a part of the kind of the DNA of the company. So maybe what I'll start is to ask Sidney and Michael to share with us their perspective of how innovation can happen in China as well as the rest of the global network. So with Sidney, would you like to start?
Okay. I would like to mention 3 points to frame my remarks on innovation, especially on supply chain management. First of all, looking at manufacturing sectors, I mean, you're looking, I just heard a lot of great stories about IT industry, about the margins. In manufacturing, the margins is much lower. So any innovation is important. For instance, everybody knows that from the cost perspective, $1 saved in cost management for a 5% margin business equals 20%, $20 you earned from the sales. So innovations in supply chain is extremely critical. Now, the meaning of innovations, as Professor Lee just said, it's not very limiting. You look at materials, you look at processes, you look at business model. So they're all over the place. Now, you look at innovations in terms of supply chain and manufacturing. Now, you have to think about what happens when we start business, for instance, in China. You're looking at the ultra-frugal manufacturing with highly efficient supply chain management at the core. And this is really demonstrated by the Greater China is the most competitive nation in the world for highly cost-sensitive industries, like OEM, like ODM, and like the basic electronic components. Why they're there in China? Because China is so efficient. And you look at supply chain as a whole, what is that strategically important? You look at all the different brands that we know about. For instance, logistic companies, DHL, FedEx, and UPS globally Of course, the excellence in supply chain management. Then you look at retailers like Walmart. They spend so many different innovation and investment into their supply chain. And you look at company like Starbucks. Again, the reason why they're ahead of everybody else's is because they have an innovative supply chain systems that supply fresh products into a network of retail outlets. And particularly, you look at people like us, the manufacturers. How can we take the business of in-house manufacturing and become their arms of manufacturing? It's because we have innovative supply chain models.
Well, thank you. Michael?
Okay, well, one thing everybody should understand is we're talking more about hardware now as opposed to, software business models. It was interesting to hear this last panel and the questions that in the end, when is China going to be, more than half or whatever the question was, in innovation happening in China, and that way understates the value of what's taking place in China today. At least when you're looking at the hardware side. So here's how I think about innovation. Innovation takes place, and again, we're talking about hardware, but it takes place in a bunch of different places. So there's an R&D lab, and we tend to think about innovation of coming out of an R&D lab, but that's actually a pretty small part of where innovation takes place. So you have R&D, then you have engineering, where lots of innovation takes place. I mean, you get an idea, it comes out of R&D, you send it into the engineering group. The engineering group goes and works with suppliers and figures out what kinds of materials and how to make things cheaper. And that's maybe the biggest chunk of innovation. And then you have the factory floor, which is an incredible place where innovation takes place, because that's where you're finding out how to make things cheaper and better, what works, what doesn't work. You're constantly innovating on the factory floor. Then you have the supply base, which is another incredible place where innovation takes place, which is suppliers coming up with ideas of how to of substituting materials or how to do things cheaper or how to do them in a different way. And then you have logistics, which Sidney just talked about, which is an enormously valuable part of the innovation. And if you look at lots of companies, I mean, it's one thing to talk about inventing Facebook, but it's another thing to talk about innovations like Whole Foods, which is a very successful company in the United States. It's basically just a grocery store, but coming up with a different way to present it, go after a different demographic, if you will. That's hugely innovative and has created a huge amount of value without coming up with some rocket science innovation. GoPro, you may know, is a company that has created a camera. There's no magic to it. Cameras are out there, but they packaged it up in a slightly different way and they marketed it, to a different group of users, and it's been a hugely innovative and hugely successful company. So many of these places where innovation takes place is actually where China has excelled. When I was running Flextronics in the early days, the way everybody did products in the United States to have them manufactured in China was you would develop the product in the United States and you would start manufacturing and you would do prototyping and you'd do all this stuff to sort of get it all worked out and then send it over to China to do the work. And that turns out to be just a horrible idea. And it's a horrible idea because it ignores all of that innovation that takes place, what's already happening in China incredibly efficiently and incredibly effectively, where you get all these inputs from the suppliers and from the engineering people and from the factory floor people and all that kind of stuff. So 10 years ago, 15 years ago, most people got the idea that why don't we take advantage, let's do the things we do in the lab, for example, in the United States. That's a very valuable thing. But then let's not ignore all these other places where innovation takes place, which if you look at China has been absolutely breathtakingly fabulous on this topic. And so now that's moved much more to taking advantage of all those kinds of things that take place in China. And so it's terrible to listen to people talk about there's just not that much innovation in China, because that's really wrong. And if I can just make one other example. One of our portfolio companies is in the LED lamp business, which everybody knows now is, is taking over from incandescent compact fluorescents. And it's a US-based company with US-based R&D and US-based manufacturing. And one of the things we did when we got involved is we went over to China specifically, where it turns out 90% of all the lamps in the world are made in a 25-mile area. And the amount of innovation taking place there, which is maybe not some of the fanciest stuff and all of that, but the amount of innovation that's driving costs out and creating product proliferation, all this kind of stuff is absolutely breathtaking. And we've now transitioned not only the manufacturing, but maybe 80% of the R&D into this place where there's all this really cool stuff going on, and the costs have dropped by 30 or 40%. And even more importantly, we're getting to market faster. We're getting, higher quality, more differentiated products. And so this is not a US-only thing. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, given that Sidney and Michael both have this deep experience with the two largest EMS companies in the world, Foxconn and Flextronics. So I have to ask this question, is that Andy Grove, a few years ago, wrote an article in the Fortune magazine, which I think have stirred a lot of discussions. And his point is that innovation will require manufacturing and design being closely together and interacting with each other. And I also have read that like Apple's highly innovative products, arguably innovative products of iPhone, has to depend a lot on Foxconn, not just in manufacturing, but also in part of the innovation. And Cisco's successful product of Viking router depend on Foxconn. When Microsoft introduced Xbox, it's highly dependent on Flextronics. So it's no longer purely Microsoft or Apple or Cisco individually successfully innovating. And so behind every successful innovative product, sometimes maybe there is behind it a very powerful co-innovator. So I wonder if Sidney and Michael can share, what do you think? Is that true? Is it truly that innovation requires multiple players working together in some cooperative fashion, and that would accelerate innovation? And China plays a role because of the manufacturing deep expertise.
Well, you do, because if you look at the speed of innovations in terms of pushing out new products into the market, right? And I mean, traditionally, the approach, let's say 10 years ago, is you have engineers, they're in their closets, they're in their lab spaces, they dream up something, they mock it up, they tested it, they think it's great, or they using computer-aided techniques and do some optimization, they think it's great, then they ship it out. But the problem is, for the last 2 decades, manufacturing bases has shifted from the United States to Asia, particularly China. So a lot of what we call DFM, design for manufacturability, that expertise is actually shifted. So when you're looking at product development, especially advanced product development, it's great to dream of something in the lab, but it's very different when you try to put it into mass production. I'm not talking about making it up. Making it up, you can make 1 or 2 great-looking models, but how do you make sure you consistently have them out in the volume of millions and make sure they're consistent and they have their quality? And also to make it to the target cost. Those are the very important attributes and also skills that, unless you have a very close collaborative effort from all the stakeholders, the material suppliers, the process engineers, also the design engineers, the people who are making them, and the people who are designing them, people who are marketing them, working closely together as a team, you're not going to get there. It's really just that simple.
I'd say the same thing. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and I'm a supply chain guy. And so I think that if you don't take advantage of what the supply chain offers, you just won't be as innovative a company. So I start there so that you know what the bias is. But you take a look at the the iPhone is a perfect example. I mean, what are some of the innovations in there? One is, Gorilla Glass, which came from Corning. I mean, that's a supplier-based driven innovation. That was a huge impact on that. Or a titanium case, which comes from the ability of the supply chain guys to come up with a way to create titanium and create it and to make it in that kind of product. Or you can go back even earlier to, you remember the Motorola Razr, which was a very, very innovative cell phone, was maybe the most successful cell phone product ever until the most recent round, which was, the innovation was making it incredibly thin and having a touch-sensitive keyboard. And those innovations actually came from, like, our companies. And I will say we don't get paid as much for doing this. I mean, look at Apple's margins versus supply chain margins. But truly innovative companies, again, talking about hardware, take advantage of this stuff, take advantage of the logistics management and the suppliers and the materials guys and all that kind of stuff, and incorporate that into the products that they're developing. And if they don't do that, iPhone doesn't exist. I mean, so our companies weren't the ones who did the user interface, but our companies were the ones that did lots of other innovations that went in there that you all accept as coming from Apple or Motorola or whoever. So.
It reminded me that behind every successful man, there is a woman. And behind every successful product, there is a supply chain. Anyway, so I am going to ask one last question, but I hope that you will start thinking about questions and come out to raise it with our panelists to see their perspective, right? So this question is that in the last panel, I think there was some discussion about the fact that some products or some software, in this case, mostly because the previous panel was focusing more on the software side, were not successful in maybe as wildly successful in the US, but it's imported into China and it became hugely successful. So this is adaptation. I call it adaptation, product adaptation, that is the innovation came from maybe Europe, maybe US, but then adapted into China. And the classic example in China is all these Sanjai cell phones, right? All these Sanjai cell phones, the pirate cell phone, imitation cell phones, or other imitation products. Do you consider them innovations?
Well, innovations can be very broad. If the innovations, to me, has got to have two attributes that are most important. First, it has to be new or unique, has never been done before. And second, it has to serve a purpose. It means it has to be better. If it is not better, then you're just making something new. New is not innovating, right? It has to be better than what you're trying to replace or you're trying to improve upon. So it has to be better. And it's been unique, new and unique, and it has to be better. In some of the Sanjai, some of the feature we see, yes, I see some of that. But a lot of that is, well, new for the sake of being new. For instance, a few years ago, I go to Sanjai, I see this cell phone with 6 speakers. It's like one of those hot rod. You put it on the streets, you listen to the cell phone and usually, blow your eardrum out. So, it's new, but it's not innovative.
Or it's innovative and not very useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I'd go back and use the example of GoPro. I mean, everybody has cameras, but there is a particular group of users who needed a camera that, wouldn't break when you dropped it and you could mount on different things and all of that. So the innovation there was adapting, something that's perfectly well known to a group of users who wanted to use that in a slightly different way, and that's created a hugely innovative and valuable company. That's no different from taking a cell phone, the Sanjai cell phones, and adapting something that exists to a population that wants to use it in a slightly different way. And hugely valuable companies are created about this. And this copy thing where everybody goes like, oh, China's not very innovative because they copy things, or we do a lot of investment in my firm also in South America, Latin America, Brazil and other places like this. And, people start out by copying. And it's not the nice way to say something really, because it acts like this isn't important. And all these people are doing is are adapting. Maybe it started in America and everybody sees how successful it is, and that's great. But taking that and adapting it to the local population, to how they think differently, how they work differently, how they interact differently, that is a perfectly valuable approach to innovation, as opposed to start with something brand new.
Very good, yes. I am going to ask my audience to see if you have any interesting perspective yourself to share, and also questions for our panelists on the subject of Global Innovation Network. Yes, please.
Hi, I have a sourcing and product development supply chain background, and so I've done a lot of work on the ground in Chinese factories. And while I see a lot of innovation that you mentioned, I also see a lot of gaps. And so I wanted to ask, I want to kind of talk about some of the things that you mentioned around this close collaboration that's needed from so many different parts of the supply chain in order to actually be innovative and get these products to market. What kinds of needs do these organizations have? What are the gaps that you see within the supply chain? And then, like, what tools are they using to collaborate? There's a really big difference between taking the 250 years of industrialization in the US and squeezing it into 30 years in China. But there's some key differences between that time and now, which one big one's the internet. So I'd love to see or hear from you what you think the big opportunities are there.
That's a good question.
Sorry, I don't get all the questions, but I'll try to address it the best I could. Supply chain innovations, if you look at it, basically what does supply chains mean? Supply chains means is you have a product from raw material all the way out to customers. You make them, you take them to customers. And if you look at the supply chains today, there's so many opportunities and chances to innovate. And one of the examples I gave as a Hong Hai corporate is the vertical integration model. What vertical integration does is a lot of the expertise is already in-house, right? And also the co-locations. So you don't push the goods, you don't ship it around all over the place. It's the most efficient way to operate. And on top of that, you look at the last mile. That means the products to the end customers. And we've been doing a little bit of that. For instance, we've been actually shipping our finished goods directly to our customers, and we're already doing that in China. And what does that do is that fulfill the last mile. So you go from raw material, minimum amounts of trafficking, and then you have it all done pretty much in a central located place, and then you ship it out to end customers, right? So you fulfill from end to end. And that way you really reduces all the WIP in the pipelines. And that, to me, is very important. But in order to do so, there's a lot of technology innovations you needed to get it there, right? I mean, the mass amounts of coordinations among all the different layers from materials, half-finished goods, all the way to goods, it's really mind-boggling. For instance, on display alone, I mean, if you look at LCD display, how many layers of semiconductor process you have to go through? On top of that, the layers of the glasses that people make. And then you have to reduce the thickness of it to a certain level, and then you actually bind it together. If you look at some of the TV screens, I mean, just making the screen itself, you probably ship the materials half around Asia already. So how do you have the innovations and also have the visions to bring all the related suppliers closer to your raw materials and also closer to your end markets and optimize on that? That is all by itself the biggest challenge innovating. And we're doing some of that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, distance is one gap for sure, and that's why you hear a lot of talk about, should we bring manufacturing back to the United States and all that stuff. So that's for sure a really big challenge, and it's getting somewhat easier. The other two challenges that I see, particularly in China, since we're talking about China, is flexibility and communication. I mean, these are places where there's more work to be done. So in all manufacturing, go back to the history of manufacturing, all manufacturing facilities want long production runs and be able to plan everything easily. And we've become a very different world about that, where everybody wants to customize and do something right away. And that is not necessarily the strength of Chinese manufacturing. So that's one. And communications also obviously another issue. The questioner asked about the impact of the internet. The good news about the internet is it's making both of these things easier. I mean, it allows you to communicate, very rapidly, in real time. You can draw things and see them. You have much better communication tools, and you also have the ability, the tools, if you use the internet right, to deal with the flexibility part, where you can have orders coming in every day or every minute instead of being bunched up and sent over once a week or once a month. You have much more visibility if using the internet to what the supply chain is and what your suppliers are doing and what your customers are doing and so on. But those are definitely two areas where there are some gaps between sort of the best in the world and sometimes what takes place in China.
Good, thank you. We have a question there, and then I'll switch to the right-hand side.
Hi,
Yeah.
hello. My name is Samir Rayani, and I have a question about intellectual property in China. So there were more patents filed in China last year compared to the US. And for example, Honhai has tens of thousands of patents. So going forward with all this innovation happening in China, how do you see the patent landscape playing out? Do you see companies starting to litigate more patents? Do you see companies using patents more domestically to restrict competitors, or is it more for the international market? So are these patents being filed for international markets only, or is it going to have a domestic application too, in your opinion?
Rephrase that. You're asking about the intellectual properties, right?
Yes, patents.
Patents.
Specifically.
Yes, specifically.
Okay, patents specifically.
Yeah.
And your question is, the patents in
You're
China?
filing lots and lots of patents. What are you going to do with them, I guess?
Yeah, that's basically.
Okay. Great, understood. Intellectual property is very important. Patent has its value. And unfortunately, a lot of the companies outside of the United States does not recognize that value. If you look around the world and look at the patents and you look at the people who collected patents, you see most of that money flow actually is coming to the United States versus anywhere else. Asia alone, you look at Korea, you look at China, you look at companies like us, we're actually applying a lot of patents. We're coming off to the world. So you look at top 20 patents holders in the world, a lot of them are foreign companies. But unfortunately, between, say, United States and some of the companies in Japan, if you look at patent incomes, and there is a huge disparity. And that is because of the education and mindset. Companies in Asia, maybe TSMC is probably only one of the exceptions. They mostly apply patent. They do it the wrong way. They do it as a defensive measure. They do it to say, I'm going to keep my competition out. They do it to say, I'm going to apply patent, so when people sue me, I'm going to have a protection shield. That is wrong. That is not how you treat patent. Patent should be an asset. You look at how valuable Motorola is. I mean, as a company making phones, they're probably not very successful at the end, but their patent worth a lot of values. That's why Google acquired them. And you look at patents, that's the reason why United States, we got this patent troll company that go out there and buy the patents that people forgot, and actually they're basic patents. So you have to educate your people on patent application. Patent is an asset, okay? It's not a protective measures. I mean, it does have values, but you have to mine them. And then you have to have a system to actually release that value out.
Okay, question? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Michael Lee, data scientist Foursquare. I was just up there a little bit earlier. I'm really interested in your views on 3D printing And in particular, do you see this as sort of a challenge to manufacturing traditional supply chains? Do you see this as something that augments that? What are your thoughts?
3D printing, first of all, 3D printing it's not going to challenge the traditional manufacturing. The scale is too small, okay? But 3D printing has its place. We actually use 3D printing. I was the first one to introduce 3D printing into Hong Hai back in 1992. So 3D printing been around for a long time. And it's one of those technologies that have improved through the years. It's great in terms of doing prototyping, doing mock-up samples, doing your conceptualization. So it's great. It has its place. But in terms of mass productions, no, it's not there yet. It's too expensive, and also it's too slow.
Yeah, but I have something to add to that, because I have a slightly different point of view. Of course, I completely agree with what Sidney said, but I do think it has the potential to be disruptive, because it's only now that people are starting to figure out how to really work with 3D printing, that there's the software and the tooling for it and all that kind of stuff. And it's probably never going to have an impact on really true high-volume manufacturing. But what I was just talking about before is that this mass customization, where everything wants to be a little bit different, I think there's a hugely disruptive opportunity. But it's likely to be decades, not years. I mean, this isn't something that's going to happen tomorrow. Another question in the back?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Jeff Hagan. I'm with eJoule. We are an innovative manufacturing company. So my question and my perspective are not unbiased, and you'll probably hear that. My question's around funding of innovation. And we've been talking about software, and if you walk around Silicon Valley, that's all anyone talks about these days. And historically, I think if you look at the funding cycles, there has been a cycle, and it's been hardware chasing software, chasing hardware, and the funding has gone along with that. But in the 30 years that I've been operating in Silicon Valley, and I just repatriated from China, I've never seen an environment that is so negative with regard to hardware and manufacturing innovation, pure scientific innovation, and the funding of it. And it's really at a nadir that I've never seen. And so it's a kind of a two-part question. The first part of it is, have we fundamentally moved away, particularly in Silicon Valley, from ever funding hardware and manufacturing innovation again, number one. And number two, who is funding it? It's hard to find anyone willing to do it. Someone said to me, you'll probably laugh at this, but Silicon Valley has lots of vision and no money, and China has lots of money and no vision. So I'd love to get your thoughts.
Finish that question. Okay, so I would love to tell you, because I'm an investor today, right? And we are for sure funding hardware. And nobody is. You said this exactly right. This is just unbelievable to me. I mean, I'll just tell you a quick little story about this. So, like, semiconductors, I mean, Silicon Valley was, silicon for semiconductors. And, like, nobody wants to go near a semiconductor company today. And we're investing in them. We've made 4 commitments in the last 30 days. And here's what's really interesting about this. Silicon Valley was created, all the venture firms here were started by semiconductor guys. Don Valentine and Erwin Federman, these guys, they've all retired, and all the young guys, I'm sure there's venture guys, and I don't know who the audience is here really, but everybody just hates hardware. I mean, the most successful company in our portfolio, and really one of the most successful hardware companies in a long, long time, is GoPro. And we made this investment, and we got turned down by some of the best to join us in this one, because people just hate this kind of stuff. The semiconductor business that everybody hates today has turned into exactly the kind of business that Silicon Valley venture investing was based on, which is it's a software business. You have TSMC and UMC who are doing all the hardware. You don't have to build factories anymore. You take a bunch of hotshot engineers, I'm sure there are lots of them in the crowd here, who work in a 40 by 40 space doing software, and they go to TSMC to get a sample, and then they sell their companies for 5x a year later, and nobody's doing this, but we are. Riverwood Capital, remember that name.
So can we have lunch together, please?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. The next question.
Yes, Alan Wang from LinkedIn. Question As costs and actually as everything, as prices and of land and factories and labor rise in China, what is the future for two types of products? One are obviously the ones that are more lower skill, labor intensive, and of course products on the other side that are perhaps more higher skill or require more technological investments. What is your view on, with rising costs, how that affects those two types of products?
Well, first of all, let's look at this phenomenon and challenges in China. China has firm one-child policies, and it's increasing impact on both labor demographics and the nature of the availability of workforce. Okay? First and foremost is the effect of the total labor pool from the inverted demographics pyramid. So workforce has reduced. We're into the second generation under this policy. You know, fewer people are going into the workplace. And also, by nature of this, the second generation coming in, I mean, they're coming from a relatively prosperity, better living standards, and also the fact that they grew up in internet space. So they're very less patient in terms of manufacturing jobs. And thirdly, because a lot of them are actually the only child, so the center universe surrounds around them, right? So in terms of manufacturing, where you actually place the premiums on teamwork, collaborative work, it's going to be very difficult. So there's a lot of challenges here. And the cost of wages for the last 10 years have been increased 15 to 20% every year. So we all know that. The important thing is, well, how do you get your productivity gains? How do you go on automation processes? And some of the really labor-intensive operation, we see it actually go to Southeast Asia and some other lower wages places. But that itself does not solve the equation, because what happens is when you go across the border, for instance, to Vietnam, to Myanmar, and Southeast Asia, you bring in yourself other questions that are challenges. For instance, I mean, when you go to the places that are not as connected as China, so a lot of the materials still need to be shipped around, and then you have the taxation costs, and those are the challenges you have to overcome. So it's not a simple question as to, okay, I have a labor-intensive operations. Now China wages has been up for the last 10 years. Now I'm going to find a place with much lower wages and actually has a plentiful supplies of laborers, and I just ship my operations over there. Well, that is only solve the equations of wage, but that doesn't solve the cost of the other stuff associated with it.
I'll throw out something that's not probably going to get talked about any other place today, but it's something that people are not talking about, and it's going to have more of an impact than the rising cost of labor in China, and that's the cost of energy. You know, one of the great innovations taking place in the world today is shale gas. And what's happening is the cost of energy is dropping like a stone in the United States compared to the rest of the world. And that actually has a gigantic impact, not on every industry, but on a lot of industries. And that's going to be a big driver, which is not China going up in cost because it's sort of stable there, but in fact dropping fast in the United States. And that actually is going to shift a little bit of the balance here.
Good. I think we will have time for two more questions, but maybe what I will do is to ask each of you to raise the question, and then we ask the panelists to pick and choose the answer. Yes.
My name is Gregory Manker, and you guys recently fielded a question about hardware funding. And my question is, in the past, we've had large companies like Apple and Sony, Samsung, not necessarily Samsung, but Apple and Sony that become large customers of contract manufacturers. Recently, because funding has dried up, contract manufacturers have developed their own vehicles to fund, nurture, and grow these companies internally. So Flextronics recently launched Lab iX. Are we going to see the next Apple and GoPro coming from the likes of Foxconn or Flextronics and are we moving into a future where these companies are going to be grown internally?
Great question. And then
That is
I'll
a good
pick the
question.
other question, and then we can answer. Yeah. So
My question, I'm Bob Marchavickas from Specialized Bicycles, and my question is, how do you see China being impacted by a lot of the free trade agreements that are happening right now, whether it's TPP or TAFTA or some of those other big trade agreements that are really designed to, I'll say, take the focus off of China as a manufacturer and supplier?
I'm going to take that one. I'll do the first one.
Okay, I'll answer the second
yours.
one. That is a good question. China joined WTO in 2001, and the Beijing government began negotiating a network of bilateral trade agreements focusing on Southeast Asia. Many of the effects actually came into place actually now, 2010. What we're seeing now is Asia's well-developed economies are actually investing a lot more money and capitals into the less developed ones. And what does this mean is we're seeing supply chain reaching across borders now into Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and elsewhere. Okay? And it is driving some of that away. But like I said earlier, when you do that, you're also facing with a lot of challenges. Critical factors including the basic input cost, logistic cost, energy cost, management cost, and local transactions and taxation cost. Free trade agreement does put some of the manufacturing footprints into Southeast Asia. No doubt about it. It's happening. But how big an impact of that? We're starting seeing some of it since 2010. Okay? It's not at the level where we see a paradigm shift, but there's some effect of it.
So I'll take the first one. It's a good question, and it actually goes to the purpose of a lot of what's going on today anyway about innovation. I don't think so. In answer to your question, the question is, are you going to see, great companies spawned out of the contract manufacturers? I don't think you can, and the reason is the really great entrepreneurs, engineers, designers, they don't want to work for these kind of companies. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, I ran one, he ran one. I mean, so we did this for a living. But these companies are trying to add more value, right, to try to get their margins up. So you do more on the R&D side, or you fund things that you think can turn into customers. But we always had that. I mean, when I left Flextronics, we had 15,000 engineers around the world, or 25,000, whatever the number was. But great entrepreneurs, the people who can go create the Apples or Samsungs of the world, whatever that is, these are not the companies that they want to work in. They don't have the margins, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the panache, and so I don't think that ever happens.
But all of you are still part of that innovation network,
for
right?
sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think on that great note, let me thank my two panelists for sharing with us the perspective. Yeah. Great.